We're very excited to welcome Avalon Bunge to the Zoom session tonight. I just want to tell you very briefly about Avalon. She oversees the PCA's Ecological Restoration Grant Program and manages Pollinator HV, including the Hudson Valley Pollinator Action Guide. She also oversees PCA's local ecotype seed propagation work with Hudson Valley Seed Company. Avalon received a BA in geology from Colgate University and an MS in ecosystem restoration from the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Art and Forestry, and is currently pursuing a PhD in ecological restoration at Antioch University. Avalon lives near here in Columbia County with her husband, dog, and overflowing native plant collection. So I just want to advise everybody that this session will be recorded, and there is a possibility of putting questions into the chat, which you will see on your screen, and Avalon will tell you more about that. So over to you, Avalon.
Thank you so much, Vivian, and it's lovely to be here. As I mentioned to the folks that came on a little earlier, I'm actually streaming from Ohio, which is where my family's from, and I just got to see a bunch of beautiful, like, Midwestern prairie plants today, so feeling planty inspired. Not a ton of housekeeping. I am having a little bit of a strange... Oh, there they go. If I just click on the screen, then my slides advance. So I'm going to hope my slides keep advancing because they are really pretty and I want you to see them. So Zoom housekeeping, feel free to put questions into the chat, more so maybe than the Q&A box. I am probably not going to be able to talk and watch the chat at the same time. So most of those questions I think I'm going to save for the end, but feel free to chat back and forth with one another, and hopefully I'll get to your questions. If for some reason there's a ton, I'll certainly have my contact info on the last slide, and you're welcome to get in touch with me at any point to talk more about this or other work. As Vivian mentioned, I work for Partners for Climate Action, and this project that I'm going to talk to you about tonight is our multi-year Pollinate HV initiative that has culminated in the publication of the Pollinator Action Guide that I'm really excited to share with all of you, especially since I know that you are pollinator folks. So mostly what I want to do is provide an orientation, introduction to that guide, and what you can use it for and who can use it, which, spoiler alert, it's everybody, hopefully. And I'm going to start with a little bit of that background. Then I'm going to tell you, exactly what's in the guide and where you can find it and what you might like to do with it. I'll go through the main sections of the guide, including a little bit of just science-y background on our at-risk pollinators in the Hudson Valley, and then hopefully we'll have a nice, at least like 15-20 minutes for questions and comments. So let's go to it. So I'm going to start with why Pollinator Action Guide, and again, probably preaching to the choir, since you all are the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway, but you might ask, why did a climate action nonprofit, which again, we're Partners for Climate Action based in Chatham, New York, but serving much of the whole Hudson Valley, why would a climate action nonprofit want to get involved in pollinator action? And there's tons of reasons. The biodiversity crisis that we have unfolding in parallel with the climate crisis is at least as important, and their climate work and biodiversity work are intersecting. We know we need to protect biodiversity for resilience, and also so that when we do solve this climate crisis, we have a future full of beautiful plants, animals, insects, and wildlife that we all want to actually live in. So we're doing that, hopefully solving the bigger issues. And we know that we have a lot of threats facing our pollinators right now, worldwide and also within the Hudson Valley, both sides of the river. We know also that we have a lack of current resources for our ecoregion and our bioregion. So a lot of pollinator work right now is coming either to us nationally from folks like Xerxes, or it's coming from the Midwest, which is where I am right now, from prairie restoration, which is really wonderful work that's being done, but doesn't always translate directly to the work that we're doing in the Northeast. And that's how we end up with native pollinator plant lists that include things like echinacea and black-eyed Susans that don't actually occur in the Hudson Valley. So we need current resources for us, and that's what we wanted to make. So enter the Pollinator Action Guide. I'm not going to read all these folks that contributed to it, mostly just want to point out that it took a huge village of everybody from lots and lots of scientists from different institutions to writers, photographers, designers. And then I want to highlight two folks, one being our co-founder at Partners for Climate Action, Sue C., whom some of you might know. And Sue is an incredible pollinator advocate. She started Dirty Gaia, which is a great garden organization based out of Rhinebeck and Rhinecliff. So I'm really grateful to Sue for her guidance throughout this whole process. And then I want to thank those our case study sites. So you'll hear from me at the end of this talk that part of this pollinator action guide was not just putting together a how-to guide, but actually figuring out, all right, let's get some of this work done in the real world, in the ground, get it documented and see like what it costs and what it looks like to do this work right here in the Hudson Valley. So we installed and documented 4 case study sites. And those are who is being thanked at the end. Those folks made their own resources available to get this work done, and it's really exciting. So that's the back end. The front end, who is it for? Who can use the Pollinator Action Guide? And like I said, really hoping that this can be a tool for pretty much everybody, and especially it can be used across multiple scales. So I was just in Kingston, I think last week, talking about using the guide for urban gardening, even for things like container gardening. There are plant lists that you can find useful, and then all the way on scaling up to things like farmers or large land managers. You might have fields that, just kind of get mowed every year because that's what's always been done. We can do so much better. We can do so much for pollinators in those large spaces in the Hudson Valley. This is not a baby beginner level guide, but I think intrepid beginners, even if you haven't gardened before, can find a lot that's useful in here. We have also, I want to really point out, and hopefully everybody watching this live and on the recording will take a note. We will have funding to install projects using this guide coming up this fall. So Partners for Climate Action is a primarily funding nonprofit. That's the other project that I run, is our ecological restoration grants. We're going to open that request for funding again this fall, and we're going to have a focus track on pollinator projects that use the plant lists and the tools and the techniques in this guide to get this work done around the Hudson Valley. We raise every dollar that we grant out, and we will continue to raise funds for that grant program until the day the RFP closes. So if you are moved to support our restoration grant fund, I would certainly love to also talk to you, and feel free to get in touch with me. I want to tell you a little bit about how we put the guide together. And so it's really a pollinator down, pollinator centric process. We first started with our science team, who went back into the historical record and lots of different pollinator records that we have. The Empire State Native Pollinator Survey, which you might be aware of, was part of this, to choose a list of about 100 at-risk target pollinators, and that's bees, butterflies, and moths for us. I'll talk about why that is. Then, having identified the pollinators who were most sort of at risk of population decline, even extinction, most in need of support with native plants, we chose the native plants that are best suited to supporting those pollinators. And that's pollen plants, nectar plants, and also host plants. So plants that help things like butterflies raise their eggs, and pollinators, caterpillars grow to maturity on host plants. So we chose the pollinators, we chose the plants for the pollinators, then we had the plant list, then we took the plant list and turned that into landscape designs. Our landscape designer, Landscape Interactions, did that, and then our landscapes were installed, again, at those case study sites last year. We also did a pre-survey of what pollinator insects were present at each of our case study sites before we planted, and we plan to go back and do that once the plantings mature. And all of that came together into a how-to guide, hopefully for all of you to use to do this work yourself. So the guide is a completely online tool. It is available at pollinatehv.org. You're welcome to just pop that URL into your browser and scoot right off this Zoom call and just cruise around on the site. You can do that and then come back and ask me questions about it in 20 or 30 minutes. Or you can hang out and I'll tell you a little bit more kind of how to orient yourself and move through the guide. So it's in 4 sections. We have the background section, which is what I'm going to dive into a little bit next. Then we have the how-to guide, which really walks you through everything from planning for a project, again, at multiple scales, all the way up through how to prepare your site for success, for installing both seeded meadows, small gardens, hedgerows, like woody plantings, and then how to manage it so that you maintain that diversity into the future. The case studies, the 4 case studies, all of which planted some combination of gardens and those woody hedgerows and seeded meadows, are documented in the guide. Really, really thoroughly documented with like exact budgets, timelines, who did the labor, how many volunteers were needed, that type of thing. And then we also have a resources section with, if the information that we gathered for you isn't enough, we have other books, apps, tools, and also all of our downloadable plant lists, nursery lists, pollinator lists, all that good stuff is gathered together. So I'm going to dive into that section 1 and zoom out a little bit to why pollinators and why pollinators that are at risk here in our beautiful Hudson Valley, which is about to start looking like this as we head into fall, one of our favorite times of year. So who are the pollinators? Probably don't have to tell you, but a pollinator is any agent that transports pollen between flowers. So it could be an insect, could be a mammal like a bat, could be a bird, could be a human. Sometimes if you've ever like pollinated with a paintbrush, some people do that, I know, on their really precious fruit trees. But for the Hudson Valley Pollinator Action Guide, we are focusing on bees, butterflies, and moths, even though there are many other insects that can play roles in pollination. The reason for that is primarily that's who we know the most about. We have not studied, we being the scientific community, much about those wasps, beetles, flies, and other pollinating creatures. So we're hoping that when we start to plant native for the ones that we do know about, it'll precipitate more research, and we'll also be able to support some of the ones that we're not intentionally supporting, just sort of as like a knock-on effect. So the one thing that I want to point out about pollinators, besides like what categories do they fall into in terms of type of insect, is that we have this categorization specialist versus generalist. And this is a little bit important as we move into our discussion of why some pollinators are at risk. A specialist is a pollinator that can only use a certain type of plant, whether it's for food or for raising caterpillars. And the monarch, which is right here, is our classic specialist that everybody knows about. Monarch caterpillars can only eat milkweed. If you tried to feed a monarch caterpillar the zinnia flower that this adult is nectaring on, it wouldn't be able to eat it. It would probably eventually just starve to death. They've got to have milkweed. So a lot of our native pollinators have really, really specialized relationships with our native plants. And that often means that as we lose those native plants, we start to lose some of those specialist pollinators. There are other reasons that our pollinators might be at risk of decline. I'll get into some of those too. But I wanted to point out our specialists. We also, of course, have generalists that can forage on lots of different flowers, or the caterpillars can be, hatch out on any kind of plant and do fine. That's a little bit rarer. But just wanted to point out that distinction, not that extinction. Now we'll talk about extinction. This is some bad news. You might have heard of the Empire State Native Pollinator Survey, which was a massive citizen science effort, just wrapped up, I think 2 years ago, was published by the New York State Natural Heritage Program. And they found that depending on how you slice it, up to 60%, depending on what you call endangered or not, up to 60% of the native pollinator species that are endemic to the state of New York may be at risk of extinction if we don't do something. So this is really bad news, of course. There are a number of factors playing a role. Some of them have already started to be mitigated, and there's a lot we can do about the other ones. But why? So let's talk about what some of those factors are. First of all, pesticides. We all know this one. Nobody wants to be spraying pesticides onto any plant because there's a chance that a pollinator or an insect can eat that plant and it'll just up and die. This pesticides, obviously, we use for insects that we consider pests in agriculture, but most of them are broad spectrum and can have lots of overflow effects into our beneficial insects as well. There's some good news about pesticides, actually, which I'll get to. I want to also mention habitat loss. Certainly, I think for my Hudson Valley friends, we've all seen the crazy levels of development pressure just sort of coming up around us for as long as we have lived in this beautiful area. Something like 95 to 98% of the total area of the lower 48 states has now been modified by humans, either for development and habitation or agriculture, a lot of it being agriculture and ranching especially. And of course, that development pressure continues. So that means less area for native plants, less space, less resources for pollinators. A big one that we also deal with, which is the image here. I know he's cute, but deer are a huge, huge problem that we have right now in New York for our forests, which if you're interested in deer's impact on forests, you might want to check out the work of Partners for Climate Action's Forest Health Task Force, which is working on forest health, obviously, deer being a huge threat to it. Deer are also a threat to pollinators. Why? So our native pollinators, like I was saying, many cases rely on native plants. Deer are also a native species. They rely on native plants. They're eating all the plants that the pollinators need, and the pollinators are being squeezed and not having the resources that they need. So this deer overpopulation crisis is the product of decades of management choices that we humans have made. We have a responsibility, I think, to be mitigating that. And if we do, we'll have healthier forests and we'll have more native plants and more pollinators. That would be awesome. But there are also more things that we can do. And the Hudson Valley Pollinator Action Guide is not just about deer, it is mostly about native plants. So I'll get to that. So I am not a pollinator specialist. I am mostly a plant person. And when I started this pollinator work, this is sort of my perspective, like, well, there are a lot of bees out there. I mean, it seems like I hear a lot of buzzing, in my garden. And I hear this sometimes, maybe less so from all you pollinator pathway folks, but just want to address it quickly. When you go out in your garden and you hear a lot of buzzing, it's very often the case that you're hearing the buzzing of these two bees in particular. On the left, the common eastern bumblebee is a super good generalist. It can forage on almost any flower. Right now it's on a native aster in this image, but can get pollen from lots of non-native and invasive flowers. It is a native bee itself, and its populations are not declining. They are actually stable or even increasing. So there are some bees and probably butterflies, moths, wasps, etc., that are doing fine. This is one of them. So this is sort of that nuance that makes us say, all right, let's see what the ones that aren't fine need. So let's set aside the common eastern bumblebee, and let us also set aside the honeybee, which is the recipient of one of the most successful misguided PR campaigns in like the history of ecology and environmental science. So the honeybee is not a native species in New York or indeed anywhere in North America. It's a European import. It plays no ecosystem role really except to mess with the native pollinators and steal their forage that they need. Here's a honeybee. This is actually in my garden, foraging on a New England aster, which is a really critical keystone native plant for many of our native pollinators. Honeybees are not a conservation priority because they're not a native species. So we talk about saving honeybees to save bees is like saving chickens to save wild endangered songbirds. It's apples to oranges. Doesn't mean that doesn't mean I hate honeybees or that I don't see their value as an agricultural species, but just want to be clear that we're setting those guys aside as we're talking about our native pollinators. And here's a piece of good news for those native pollinators, going back to the pesticide question before. So many of you may know about or even worked on the recent Birds and Bees Protection Act, which is going to ban that worst class of neurotoxic broad spectrum pesticides from the state of New York. And we do hope that that's going to do a lot to stop like actively killing our pollinators that we still have. That should be, I think it's phasing in 2026 and 27, but check my math on that. That's really good news, but it's not enough. Just stopping active harm is phase one, but we also need active restoration. We need to bring back those native plants that pollinators need for food and shelter. Many of those native plants are disappearing just like our pollinators are. And so the hope is if we can bring back the plants, we will start to bring back those pollinators. And that is sort of the premise around which we designed the Pollinator Action Guide, which I'll now tell you still more about. So the target pollinator list in the Pollinator Action Guide, again, is about 95 total New York, Hudson Valley specific native species of bees, butterflies, and moths. Over here on the right, this is a little bit of how it's presented within the website. So you can log in there. Actually, you don't have to log in, just open the link. And you'll get a more detailed introduction to the different groups of pollinators that make up this list of 95. I will say we do include a number of what we call moonshot species. So these are pollinators that might only be known from the historical record, or they haven't been officially observed in some years. We don't know if they're still present in the Hudson Valley. We don't know if planting native is going to be enough to bring their populations back, but we think it's worth trying. And of course, I want to acknowledge that we are missing hundreds, probably thousands of species, but we think this is a wonderful jumping off point, and planting native is very likely to support, continue to support insects and probably birds and the whole rest of the food chain beyond just those that are officially on our target list. So I have a few pollinator highlights from the target list, one from each category: butterfly, bees, and moths. And my butterfly highlight should be the official pollinator of the Hudson Valley, I think, because it's so beautiful, it's so unique, and it's confined to this very rare habitat. So the Carner Blue, if you've ever been up to the Albany Pine Barrens, especially in May when they do their Lupine Festival, you might be blessed with Carner Blue butterfly like landing on your shoelace, which is what happened to me one time, and it was the best day ever. They are teeny tiny, they really are that color, and they are another classic specialist. So they oviposit on lupin, wild lupin, true native wild lupin. They can't exist without it. And so we don't know, these are one of our moonshots. We don't know if just planting lupin in our gardens is going to be enough to bring these back throughout the Hudson Valley, because the lupin itself is really confined to that pine barren, sort of fire-dominated habitat that we find in the pine bush, which has shrunk a lot, been shrunk a lot, but we think it's worth trying. So let's plant more lupin, making sure that it is the wild, correct one, and let's start to hopefully see some Carner Blues. My bee highlight is probably my favorite bumblebee. I have seen one of these once. This is Bombus fervidus, the golden northern bumblebee. They live up to their name. They're huge, they're golden, and they are threatened not because they need such a specific food source, but because they, in a lot of cases, because of their habitat. So this is a ground nesting bee, which many of our bumblebees and many of our bees do nest in the ground. And what happens is, when we either pave or like deep mulch or otherwise sort of make our surfaces impervious, of course they can't nest there. They also are very often found around sort of field edges. And so when we till our fields in agricultural systems, their overwintering habitat is destroyed and their populations are severely diminished. So we think that might be part of what's going on, threatening the golden northern bumblebee. There's a lot we can do in agriculture and also, of course, with native planting to help support these guys. And then my moth. So if you have white flowers in your garden, if you have very, very fragrant, especially white flowers, you probably have moth pollinated flowers. They pollinate at night. They're a super important pollinator. And they also are threatened in many cases. So this is the waved sphinx moth, which is threatened in New York. It's also beautiful and charismatic. It is sort of a quasi-specialist. It mostly lays its eggs on a couple of different species of trees, and its young need those trees to come to maturity. One of those trees is the ash tree, and we know what's happening with our ashes in New York, I know, is that they're being threatened by an insect that we really don't want around here. So that's bad. That might be part of what's going on with the waved sphinx moth. But luckily for them, they are a little bit more adaptable than something like the Carner Blue. They can also, caterpillars can also come to maturity on oak trees. And oaks are like the keystone species for, I think they host something like 430 plus total native caterpillars. So if you only have one pollinator plant in your garden, I would almost say make it an oak tree, which might be surprising because we think about flowers so much in terms of our pollinators. So I wanted to highlight each of those guys, and now I'm going to talk more about what plants they all need. Again, there's 95 total pollinators. Those are just 3 that I pulled out to sort of get to know. You can get to know them all within the guide, and you can also get to know our plants. So the plants that we recommend support our 95 target pollinators with pollen, nectar, or host services. So again, caterpillar habitat, or some combination of those 3. Many, especially trees, like our flowering spring trees, can be a pollen source, a nectar source, and a host plant. So that's a lot of bang for your buck. Trees and shrubs are on there. Certainly perennial flowers, also grasses and sedges can be really important host plants for a lot of our butterflies, a few biennials, and even some annuals. And how will you find those plant lists? You will see them in 2 forms on our website. We have our quick start, curated lists. So this is like what you can print off at home. They're all downloadable, and take it down to the nursery that weekend and just like pull out our favorite pollinator garden plants. This is an example. They're usually like double-sided, so 2 or 3 pages like this for each of the quick start lists. And those are for a bunch of different site conditions. It's not every single plant on our list of 155 that will thrive in full sun, because there are many, but they're sort of our favorite or my favorite picks for home gardener conditions. And we have, I think, 9 total, including 2 at the bottom, which are, we've pulled out every plant that our target specialist butterflies need, and also all of the forage plants that our specialist bees need. So if you're interested in planting for specialists, check out those downloadable PDFs. If you want to go further, which you probably do because this is really cool stuff, you can check out the complete plant list, and I've called this for experts and enthusiasts. You don't have to be an expert. You just have to be, again, sort of that intrepid beginner level to download this spreadsheet and start scrolling around. So what we have is plants over here in the leftmost column. Those are the Latin plant names. And all this stuff up to this middle gray column on the left side is plant info. So when does it bloom? How tall is it? How wide is it? Oops. What kind of sun? What kind of soil? Is it a perennial? Is it a tree? What is its exact range? Like everything you could want to know about the plant. And then over here we have the pollinator connections. So the way that you read this, you can read it either pollinator down or plant over. So let's take plant over. Suppose you like this plant right here. I know you can't read it, so I'll tell you that's Actaea racemosa, which is black cohosh. Used to be Simicifuga, but now they put it in Actaea. Anyway, so you're like, okay, Actaea racemosa, I like that. Okay, it blooms late summer. It can tolerate even some pretty shady conditions, pretty moist. I read over and over and over all the way to the right until I hit a colored box. And then I read up to the pollinator that corresponds to that colored box. And it turns out, okay, the pollinator in that box is the Appalachian azure, which is a beautiful butterfly. And the key is over here. Pink is host plant. Now I know Actaea racemosa is a host plant for the Appalachian azure, and so on and so forth. And you can see that some pollinators rely on lots and lots of plants, and conversely, some plants correspond to lots and lots of pollinators. So that's a fun downloadable list to play with. And you can, as I say, download it so you can sort it by anything you might want to sort by. And recommend checking it out. Don't get intimidated, just a spreadsheet. It is really cool. So then you've learned about your plants, you've learned about your pollinators, and what do we do with all this information? So then we can move into the section of the guide that is the actual how-to, the what do you do on your land, no matter what scale or what your land looks like. Actually, I guess I should say not quite whatever your land looks like, because there are a few different landscape types that I recommend more than others for this type of restoration work. And I want to quickly mention what those are. So lawn is obvious. We call it green concrete. We don't need it. Kids don't really need that much of it. Much better enrichment experience for young people to be surrounded by native plants and animals and diversity. Hill your lawn, plant pollinator garden. That's pretty obvious stuff. Might be a little bit less obvious. This middle one, that's a hayfield, actually a fallow hayfield that's just being mowed. And most or all of the hayfields and sort of the just mowed open areas that we have in the Hudson Valley, if they're grass dominated, those are European pasture grasses. This does not have a lot of native species in it. It's mowed in the summer, which sets back our natives and promotes those cool season grasses. We can do a lot better than this if it's not being actively used for agriculture. We can start transitioning systems like this to more native, like Northeast prairie systems. And then our corn, our conventional agriculture, there's a lot of room for improvement here as well. So the main thing these have in common is these are all really human-dominated landscapes, and that's kind of the type of environment that we're thinking about working in. So don't take this guide into some like semi-pristine ecosystem and then start messing around with things. Definitely start with the human-dominated landscapes. Sorry, I'm changing my light around here. I started turning very red in the lightscape, but hopefully you're looking at the pictures and not so much my face. All right, So once you've selected a site, which there's information on that in the guide, we have a chapter about planning your project. Again, planning for things like a garden at any scale, a hedgerow, so a woody planting, trees and shrubs heavy, or a seeded wildflower meadow, how to select your site, how to design your project, and then how to choose your plants for your site and match your plants to your site are all covered within there. Preparing your site. So we have a chapter about preparing your site, which is divided into, I think, 3 different options for site prep. And many of you might be familiar with smothering, which we often do with tarps. That's a really great way to kill a lawn. Works super well within one season. And the reason I should say why we're doing all this site prep is before we plant anything, we want to get rid of weed seeds. We want to make sure that whatever existing vegetation is there is not going to regrow and compete with the natives that we're planting. So that's site prep. So we go through smothering, where to find a tarp, what's the best tarp. Many of them are very reusable and even recyclable for those that are wary of plastic, which I totally understand, but this can actually be a really good and even fairly sustainable option, especially at those small scales like a lawn. And of course, if you just want to make a small garden, smothering can be a great option, just using like flattened cardboard boxes over the course of a season. For larger scale sites, we talk about repeated tilling, which is a way of killing really like killing the existing vegetation on a site, exposing more weed seeds, letting them germinate, and then killing those weeds and repeating this over the course of a season. It's pretty destructive to soil life and soil microbiome. So none of these are like perfect. Site prep is sort of the part of all of this that you have to sort of hold your nose a bit. Repeated tilling has its pros and cons, as does herbicide. Herbicide is not something that we take lightly or that we recommend as a first resort, but in our era of often very pernicious invasives such as mugwort, or in cases like one of our case study sites where the site was a conventionally managed cornfield that had just been herbicide drenched for years, we said, all right, we'll do one more herbicide treatment done right by the professionals to get rid of the existing vegetation, and then it'll never have to suffer this again. So if your site, if that rings a bell for the site that you're managing, we go through how to do herbicide correctly, and that does always start with contacting a professional. So those are the 3 site prep methods covered in great detail in the guide. Site prep I put first because it usually starts in the spring. So this is sort of the timeline I would go through if I was doing this project. I'd start my site prep, and then while it's sort of in process over the summer, I would have the fun part of sourcing my plants. So this is all covered in the guide. We have a 60-line native nursery list, which is also a spreadsheet. You can download it and sort it by whatever information you're looking for. So if you're into local ecotypes, we have a list of nurseries that are doing like local genetic propagation, folks that sell bare root trees, which I know can be really important, trees and shrubs, whether they ship, whether they're local to you, all that info is in our native nursery list. And we also have a chapter on invasive jumping worms, which is nobody's favorite topic, but they can be pretty pernicious as well. And the nursery trade is a major source of their spread. So we have a chapter about how to mitigate that. We also, if you are doing a wildflower meadow and not a garden planting, this is something that I'm really excited about. We worked with Ernst Seeds, which is one of the major, probably the main East Coast native seed supplier, to design 5 custom native seed mixes. And this, another spreadsheet, you can download it. It's got ordering instructions, it's got item numbers, it's got exactly how to work with these seed mixes. All you have to do is call up Ernst or the seed company of your choice, although the item number would be different if it's not Ernst. And place your order for however much seed you need, and the costs are in there too. That's really exciting. And while we're on the subject of seed, I want to direct your attention to the Pollinate HV local ecotype seed collection, which launched just a couple of weeks ago with the Hudson Valley Seed Company. So I'm going to put the link actually in the chat because I didn't update my slide here. It's bit.ly/PaulHV. And there are, let's see, bit.ly/PaulHV. There are 2 species that are available at that link right now, but we're hoping for up to 20 species that are going to be local ecotypes. So we did wild ethical collection working with professional seed collectors of the parent seed, grew that seed out into plugs and plants like this, working with our wonderful partner, Tiny Meadow Farm. Then the Hudson Valley Seed Company is growing those plants to maturity and harvesting their seed for sale so that we can preserve the local genetics of many of those pollinator plants that are recommended in the guide. So that's a really exciting project. Definitely check out the first 2. It's Great Blue Lobelia and Purple Stem Aster that are available right now, and many more to come. All right. So you spend the whole summer preparing your site, sourcing your plants, dreaming about your design, planning it all out, and then it comes time, usually in the fall, great time for native planting, although it can also be spring, to install your project, and the guide covers this as well. This is a native seed drill, which is a special tractor-mounted seed drill. It's different than like a farm seed drill because native seed is much more heterogeneous, also much smaller, lighter, fluffier than most of our typical farm seeds. So you need this special drill. We tell you where to find them. We cover that in the guide, and we also cover hand seeding for meadows. This was done at one of our case study sites, worked super well. It's a great like volunteer or friends opportunity, goes really quick and is very cheap, especially compared to the drilling. We also have a chapter on best practices for planting, which I probably don't have to teach too much to you pollinator pathway folks, because I bet you've planted a lot of plants. But if you have worked with volunteers, you may notice things like they don't always know exactly what it is like to plant a plant. So we have just a list of best practices for getting your actual trees and plants into the ground there in the guide. And then it is time for our last section of how to, which is kind of my favorite because I feel like this is the one that gets missed in so many like how-tos and garden books. It's like, okay, we're going to make this beautiful garden. We're going to plant it all out, or we're going to seed this gorgeous wildflower meadow. The volunteers come, the plants or the seeds get in the ground. We take the group picture, which like all those things are amazing and I love being part of them. But then what happens? Then what happens for the next 5, 10, 20 plus years? So we have a chapter about managing your landscape, which includes, of course, how to deal with weeds and some of the specific invasives that we have here in the Hudson Valley, and also a chapter about mowing, which is related to larger scale wildflower meadows specifically, because this is something that when you have a open landscape that you're managing for pollinators, the mowing regime needs to look a lot different than if you're just mowing to keep it open, and especially the timing. So we don't want to mow in summer or fall anymore, because that's going to get rid of our forage, our flowers, and it's also going to kill the pollinators that need to overwinter in like standing stems of plants. So mowing or burning in a mosaic pattern, and mostly in like late spring, once the pollinators start emerging, is going to be where we want to be at with mowing our larger meadows. So that's management. That's pretty much the how-to guide. So really just a super quick, like lightning overview of what you can find within it. I also want to mention all those things I talked about available for download. You can download all of the plant lists to print at home. You can download the big spreadsheet, and I hope you do. The nursery list, the landscape designs for each of our case study sites, which I'm going to get to next, as well as those meadow mixes, and then our list of resources. I bet you've all read Doug Tallamy's books, but we certainly recommend them as a great way of inspiring, in case we need more inspiration, doing this work at home. So the last thing I want to cruise through is our case studies. And again, we have 4 of these, and what they've done is taken the plant lists and the landscape designs that were created using those plant lists and installed them, and we're now monitoring them, and eventually we're going to go back and check out what pollinators are coming to visit. So we have 4. Each includes, each one within the online guide includes their landscape designs, a really complete documentation of what site prep method, what they used, where did they get their plants, like with nurseries named, how did they install it, what was their timing, their budget, etc. And then we also interviewed them all to see, okay, if you were going to do this again, or if you were going to tell somebody how to do it, how would you do it? What would you want to do differently? What do you think folks should know? So definitely check out those case studies, especially if you're enjoying these photos, because those are some of the most photo heavy pages within the guide. Shout out to Adam Dean, our great photographer. So there are 4. One of them took place in Gardner, and we did a riparian buffer planting. So this is the wall kill up here under the words. And then at the bottom of the image, those are all trees and shrubs that went in partnership with Trees for Tribs, which is a program of the New York State DEC. And I will say they are just as much fun to work with as they look like in this picture. This was the DEC staff that came out on this very rainy fall day to get all those bare root trees and plants in the ground. These are free plants. So if you have land, or if you're managing land on a tributary to the Hudson, or it might even be a tributary to a tributary of the Hudson, definitely be in touch with the Trees for Tribs program. They even helped us get different species, pollinator supporting species of trees and shrubs that they had never worked with before, and they were really into this work. They want to do more of it. And again, they will provide the plants and the tree tubes for free if you are working on riparian restoration within their target area. So the Gardner site did that. We also did deer fencing around all of those trees and shrubs. So if you're interested in electric deer fencing, check out this case study, because that's where we did it. And they also did lawn to meadow conversions. So the riparian buffer that you just saw is sort of down at the bottom right of this image. And then we did these lawn to meadow conversions using tarps. So if you're interested in smothering, check out this case study. If you're interested in hand seeding, that's also where we did it with the wonderful folks at Wildlands Mid-Hudson Valley, whose range, I'm not sure if it overlaps with the Woodstock pollinator pathway, but they're definitely on the right side of the river. So check them out. They have wonderful events. Gallatin case study is across the river in southern Columbia County. This was a much larger meadow project. This was 3 acres done with a native seed drill using our custom mix. And this case study site also used some wild collected local ecotype seed that was collected elsewhere on the property. So if you're interested in those local ecotype plants and genetics and collecting your own seed for pollinator plants, check out this case study. The Kingston case study was our urban site. It's right in the middle of downtown Kingston, uptown Kingston, I should say. It is a early childhood education center. And so they had no really outdoor classroom. They had a playground, but they didn't have any sort of life on the ground besides the sporadic lawn that they had. So we were able to transition some of these empty open beds into beautiful native pollinator habitat. This one happens to be right outside of their preschool's door. It's right behind this young volunteer who's watering right there. Here's another one of their beds. I have to update this picture because this bloomed like crazy all year. Tons of butterfly weed in here. This is a purple flowering raspberry, which is now like this big. We've got native Diarvilla lanicera, the native bush honeysuckle over here. And this is the emotional support dog at the Y. Her name is Jupiter, if you're wondering about the pup there. Our final, I believe, case study is the Red Hook case study, which took place at the former Montgomery Place Orchards cornfield, not the orchard itself, that was recently acquired by Bard College. Stunning drone shot by our photographer with the river in the back. This was our largest site. This is a 12-acre meadow, again, a former conventional cornfield that was transitioned using herbicide, judicious professional herbicide application, and drill seeding. And they also did woody hedgerows throughout that meadow planting. So an interesting case study about integrating woodies along with like seeded wildflowers, because again, so many woody plants are so important to pollinators. And they did some deer fencing and some caging of those woody shrubs as well. So those are our 4 case studies that we have. We would love to have more. And if you are doing this work, we would love to hear about it. There's a contact form on the website, which goes directly to my email. So send me info about your project. Take lots of pictures. Of course, I'm sure you already do, but as you're doing this work, take lots of pictures, and we'd love to feature you as an additional case study. We would also love to include case studies that are eligible, which is things like nonprofits, schools, libraries, municipalities, conservation advisory councils. Those are all eligible for our ecological restoration grant funding, which is going to open up again this fall for pollinator projects using the plants and the techniques documented in this guide. So keep an eye out for that. You can get on our mailing list. I'm going to put it back in the chat here, climateactionhv.org. there should be a pop-up when you click that link that says sign up for our mailing list. And if you do that, you will get information about this ecological restoration grant program. You will also get invitations when we do site visits and walks on the case study sites, which I would love to invite you to come and see these projects as they mature, and love to stay in touch. So let's do that. Let's stay in touch. Good segue. This is the sort of like screenshot worthy slide where you can find the guide. This is my email, avalon@climateactionhv.org. That's our website, our main website. Pollinate HV is our satellite program. This is one of our co-founders who manages our fundraising efforts. Again, if you're moved to support our ecological restoration grant work and get more of this done in communities all over the Hudson Valley. And thank you so much, both those live and those who might be listening at home. It's great to be able to share this work with you. And now I think I have about 10 or so more minutes for questions, which again, you can pop right into the chat or the Q&A, but ideally the chat. So I'm just monitoring one thing at once. Go ahead. And I will also say, I know that was a ton of information and like throwing spaghetti at the wall. So if you're cruising through the site later on after this, or you think of questions later, you're welcome again to email me directly, which I think my slides will only go forward, but it's avalon@climateactionhv.org. And I'm sure Vivian and the Woodstock folks can send a follow-up if you want to get in touch with me. Yeah. Pollinator questions, Monday night pollinator questions. Not much coming up, Vivian, I don't know.
Well, I don't know whether anybody's going to say anything, but I think that was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. And I'm just looking forward to clicking on pollinatehv.org myself. It'll help me so many ways, and I'm sure the same will be true of my friends. I think we have a chat thing coming up now.
We do. Well, thank you so much. That's very kind, and it was a pleasure being with you all. Question in the chat: how could someone create suitable habitat for ground nesting bees? So item 1 is don't till, which is probably not hard to not till if you're not a conventional farmer. And item 2 is do not do heavy mulch. So if you have a pollinator garden, we don't want to be replenishing heavy wood chip mulch year after year. I really only use mulch like in the first season, sometimes not even then. And that's because ground nesting bees need bare soil. So you've got to have access to bare soil for them. If we're covering it up with vegetable material, or if we're tilling it over the winter, they're not going to be able to make their homes. We can also make habitat for ground nesting bees more intentionally. If you have like really clayey soil, they don't love to nest in that. They'd rather be in, let's see, they'd rather be in like a sandy soil. So you can dig out a little patch of your soil, kind of about 6 or 8 inches deep, mix that soil half and half with like builder's sand that you can get at Lowe's or Home Depot, put it back in there and keep that weeded and open. That is sort of like the bee house for ground nesting bees. And if you're interested more in that, we can talk a little bit more. All right. How to incorporate pollinators in the home garden, very small. So let's see, I just did a talk about this actually in Woodstock, and I have a number of recommendations. One is plant for a long season of bloom. So you can check that out in the plant list. So you want to have things that are growing early in the season and then late in the season. In a small home garden, I love to have violets. Those can be an amazing pollinator plant for like the earliest season. And then for the late season, there are some really, really well-behaved asters and goldenrods. There are also some very unruly and aggressive spready asters and goldenrods. So make sure you're getting the right one. I like for the small home garden, I'm putting it in the chat. Showy goldenrod, which also happens to be the prettiest goldenrod, and smooth aster are like the nicest and well-behaved, and they bloom into the fall. And then I would also say consider a flowering shrub or a small tree, because again, you can get tons of bang for the buck from those. And there are even some container gardening resources that I can try to find later. I can't do it now because I'll lose the whole Zoom. But I think Garden for Wildlife maybe has like keystone native plants for our region for containers. So check those out. Okay, mugwort or knotweed. So knotweed is, I don't actually deal with that much because I don't work with that many wet and streamside sites. I will put into the chat the name of the contractor who worked with our gardener case study site who did do some eradication. So knotweed resource. Trillium invasive species management. And I think he will do like targeted stem injections of herbicide that work really well. If you're anti-herbicide, you should also definitely check out Toolshed, Eco Toolshed. Willow knotweed restoration. And this was an amazing project, Willow knotweed restoration project. And they basically do really aggressive repeated cutting of the knotweed where it exists on their stream banks. And then they do live staking of aggressive native fast growing willow. And they basically try to choke it out and give those natives a head start and outcompete the knotweed. That's ongoing right now. I know they have like open days where you can go do a little bit of volunteering and learn about it. Great project. So there's different herbicide and non-herbicide ways of dealing with knotweed. Mugwort, if you want to kill it, herbicide, and if you don't want to herbicide, tarping, but tarping for multiple seasons. That's the problem with knotweed. I have friends that have very successfully eradicated knotweed I'm talking about mugwort. I knew I was going to start losing it around 8 o'clock. Okay, when you're dealing with mugwort, either herbicide or using a professional, or if not herbicide, then multiple seasons of smothering, and it has to be really well smothered and like 2+ seasons. And I know that's not what anybody wants to hear, but it will get rid of it in most cases. So let's see. I lost the last question. Were those all the questions? Maybe they were. Yeah, I'm not an invasive species management professional. I'm not myself a certified herbicide applicator. The 2 invasive species that you happen to ask about are like the 2 for which I will resort to herbicide with my husband, who is a certified applicator. But I also am really inspired by the folks that I know, especially that are working on mugwort with non-herbicide techniques. And I definitely want to see more of that. And then the knotweed, again, that willow knotweed, like getting invasive species outcompeted. Alex, any suggestions on killing Oriental bittersweet? That's half your field. Bittersweet, I also hate. I know what bittersweet you're talking about. I've been to that field. And I think you have the problem because the vines are like actually on the other side of the neighbor's fence line. And so they're just going to keep dropping their berries. Mowing management. Okay, if you're clearing that, that's awesome. So you still might get some birds pooping out bittersweet. They're just going to do that forever. It's a thing we have to deal with in the Hudson Valley. Mowing management, mowing them really close when they're young is the best advice I have. If this is if it's a nursery setting where you can just keep it mowed and the plants are on benches, then that's great. If it's a meadow, that's tougher. If it's a small scale meadow, aggressive, like hand cutting, I would try. And another one where if you have that certification, you can cut and paint with a little bit of herbicide. I want to say one thing about herbicide, since I seem to be talking about it a lot, which is that I don't like it. No, that's not what I was going to say. Nobody loves herbicide. Nobody wants to use it. If we do have to resort to using it, very often what we use is glyphosate, which is this broad spectrum one. It's the compound that's in Roundup. We need to be, again, using professionals who are in like full PPE because that stuff can be really toxic. And we also want to make sure that they are not using Roundup brand glyphosate because that has surfactants in it that are directly toxic to bees. So we need to be working with professionals that are able to use like the isolated active ingredient and using it not in like a big spray form usually, but in what I'm talking about, like cutting or girdling like a tree of heaven and then super targeted application. So that's an option for bittersweet. Otherwise, like mowing it or cutting it really close in the first year and just doing that on repeat. So sort of exhausting the root is what I hear done. I have not successfully eradicated a field of bittersweet myself. So take it with a grain of salt. And I'm sorry for your invasive problems, everyone. My heart goes out to you. I know we deal with it. All right.
Well,
Any last? Oh,
I was going to say the same thing that you were, Avalon. I don't know whether anybody has any more questions, but assuming they don't, it's now 2 minutes to 8 o'clock. And I think you're totally exhausted. And wonderful. And I encourage anybody to go to the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway website to see other recordings, which will be joined by the recording of this particular presentation very soon, I hope. So thank you so much, Avalon. We really appreciate what you told us.
wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for having me and for those great questions. Again, feel free to get in touch, and I hope I'll get to see some of you either at a Woodstock pollinator project or maybe at one of those case study events. It's my favorite thing. So thank you all so much and keep up the great work for the pollinators.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.